I've told you all about the horrible history of the Russian Navy. Many times. We've talked about the horrible history of the Russian Navy over and over again, the Soviet Navy too. But enough about the horrible history, let's talk about their horrible future. And to start with, I'm going to take some inspiration from my friend Laserpig here on a video that he did where he started with a bit of a story about an online persona. And I'm going to tell you my little story of probably the most interesting person I've interacted with online that I think perfectly encapsulates today's topic and really, well, the modern Russian Navy. In the beginning, there was nothing. Then there was something. The particulars in which this occurred do cause some contention, with the culprit of humanity either being a rainbow snake or the big G. There are a few others in between, but they're the two that come to mind straight away. Really take your own choice on how we all got here. Either way, humans appeared, we built empires, and we evolved to become the only known species in the universe, so far, that were able to leave our own planets and go explore the stars. And then one day, a man we will call Redmin was born. Redmin was from one of the spicy countries in the Balkans that split out of Yugoslavia, with his family moving to Northern Europe during the period where Serbia achieved the one thing they have been proud of in the modern era, when they whiffed and shot down an F-117. Okay, that's a bit harsh. The people in Serbia are actually seeming to wake up a little and stop being useful idiots for Moscow, at least those who took to the streets in Belgrade, so there's hope there. Anyway, Redmin was somebody who presented himself as a strong man, somebody mysterious, showing strength and power. Real man. He believed his own propaganda that he was somebody who was better, smarter, and more suited to leadership than others. But for some reason, people in his life just didn't see it that way. So he went online, to Facebook, where he made a page dedicated to memes about one of the large European empires from ancient times. Redmin would then create a group of his fans together, a guard of sorts, and they would play games, chat about politics, and really just enjoy themselves. I was one of these original people, back when I was 18 and more interested in what the girls at university were up to than actually doing my uni coursework. I'd go home, to my uni res, I'd log on, I'd have fun with my friends, and then I'd switch off and go to a party. But Redmin couldn't switch off, because for the first time in his life, people were listening to him. Redmin would further raise the stakes and start to roleplay as an emperor, adopting, allegedly, but I'm pretty sure it was a LARP at first, a religion that he definitely was not, or at least he wasn't acting like. Alas, one day Redmin would appoint a patriarch of sorts to enforce this religion on the group, and slowly the group became more and more extreme. Certain people started to leave, new ones came in. Skin colour and race mixing became the topic instead of things like history and Crusader Kings too. You can guess the context to those conversations. Then one day he introduced the first of two girlfriends, and demanded that she be worshipped as an empress, giving her a name and a title. Everyone kinda had enough. There was a great schism, many of us leaving, but the path would get worse. Those who replaced the old people became yes-men to Redmin, more racist, more vicious, and zealotry became the order of the day. This continued for a time, most of us original members walking away from it all, starting lives, getting married, having children, but sometimes we'd check back in and see what was going on. Redmin would eventually become so extreme that his new beliefs, gassed up by his followers as yes-men, got him kicked out of university. He lost his friends, his girlfriend, he was alone. It turns out that big strong guy was just a shell pretending he was something he wasn't. This happens a lot more than you realise in history, and it's not just people. It's states, it's organisations too. Sometimes what you see on the surface is just that. It's a surface. And the Russian Navy now has its very own Redmin, the Admiral Nakamal. Okay, so I had this planned for December, but as per usual, being a dad at Christmas time means that you have less time than you think you do to actually do things. So instead of sitting down in a dark room with a mug of brown happy juice from the Scottish Highlands, I've been attending kindergarten stage shows with a horde of 6-year-olds singing Feliz Navidad and horribly wrapping Christmas presents myself. I'm sure none of you will complain though, because while this has been going on, I've discovered this new Russian Wunderwaffe. We are going on a journey today, ladies, gentlemen, and the Technicolor rainbow in between. But before we roll the music, don't bother trying to Google Redmin. The story is real, but the name and details have been changed. I'm very happy to say that he's doing a lot better now and is back in reality, not being led around by extremism, and is much happier for it. at least last when I checked, and he has met someone who's very nice and brings out the best in him. That story has a happy ending. This is the last happy ending you're getting for this video. Okay, so now I know what you're saying. We've spoken about the Admiral Nakamal before, and you're right, yes, we have, but that was a different Admiral Nakamal. The old Nakamal was a clapped-out, YouTube-friendly term spicy pinwheel era ocean liner taken over by the Soviets that was rammed by a container ship and sank into the Black Sea. The new one, well, it's very, very old. A monument to the past, if you will, that is being forced into a 21st century shell because Russia can't afford to do any better, and believe me, they are trying. It's time, though, to go back in time to where this tale started. We are headed back to the USSR. This would be a great time to use the Beatles music, but, you know, copyright might, it might get me a little bit. The year is 1974, and on the slipway at the Baltitsky Zavod shipyards in Leningrad, a giant metal monster is under construction. On paper, it looks incredible, the ultimate tool that can destroy NATO's hegemony at sea, smashing through a carrier group's escort with its SSN-19 shipwreck missiles, and then steaming away at 13 knots using its nuclear reactor to keep up its speed, while the smelly Western capitalist diesel engines can't keep up. These ships cause quite a panic in the Western media, with the big scary title of battlecruiser heaped on them. At a glance, you can see why the media called them this. The Kirovs were over twice the displacement of the American Virginia-class nuclear cruisers, but a battlecruiser? Not really. Large heavy cruisers, sure, but not a battlecruiser. It's just a fancy way of making it sound bigger and stronger than it actually is. Think calling the Kiev an aircraft carrier where in reality it's a floating missile cruiser with some planes on it. See, under the facade of imposing doom, the Kirovs were naturally suffering from the good old curse that was the late Soviet Union. Their missiles, the shipwrecks, you know, with the cool name like the Checkmate and the Felon, well, there were only 20 of them per ship. And the 4 ships were spread out across the entire USSR, which was big. They cost a fortune to build, let alone maintain, which, you know, it's the late Soviet Union, who cares about that? Their crew size was huge, over 710 men a pop. The dockyard space needed to maintain them, again, it's the late USSR, what's a maintenance? And just to give you an idea of what kind of state the ship was in, the main missiles, the shipwrecks, they were designed for submarines. To actually use them, the Kirovs have to partially submerge their missile tubes to fire, which takes a lot of time and looks very stupid. Never mind attempting to modify the missiles to work with the ship, no, see, that costs money. Not to mention the introduction of Aegis and the fact that this behemoth of a ship could fire 20 missiles and would have to be launched against a carrier group that was well within range and able to hit back with its planes, defended by the Ticonderoga class. Yeah, it wasn't ever going to work. The Kirovs were giant white elephants. They were never ever going to work. In fact, if you play the game Sea Power, they have been buffed beyond belief and the US forces have been nerfed to give them a chance. The Kirovs were just simply put, were built in a time and place where they could not be maintained, they could not be supported, and their role was really not existent anymore after the US caught up with Aegis. But anyway, as 1990 rolled around and the Red Banner came down, Russia, the inheritor of these 4 behemoth cruisers, Russia, where the people were surviving on pickled spinach, was now left to pick up the pieces and keep up the lie, and to build a new navy. When the Soviet Union fell, the Red Fleet was split amongst the former states. At least it was supposed to be. In reality, the USSR, being a Russian empire in a trench coat, dominated the high command with ethnic Russians, and using the Kuznetsov as an example, yes, the carrier, that was supposed to go to Ukraine because it was built in Ukraine, being outfitted in Ukraine and was owned by Ukraine at the time, was stolen by its Russian officer corps and sailed at full speed to Murmansk after dropping half the crew on the jetty. The only problem with Russia yoinking most of the fleet was that it could simply not afford it. Very quickly it found that the Kirovs were just slightly too damn expensive to dream about keeping in service. So in 1999, Kalinin was mothballed under the new name Admiral Nakamal. The Kirov was now called the Admiral Ushakov, the Admiral Lazarev was the ex-Fruns, and it followed suit in 1999. Only the Yuri Andropov, aka the Peter Veliki, or Peter the Great, funnily enough the person that Putin tries to model himself after and claims that he worships above anyone, was kept in service. Lazarev, Ushakov and Nakamal were all put into bays and left to rot, under the assumption that they could be returned back to service when they were needed. In a way, there was a general idea that when the Peter Veliki was worn out beyond repair, the other three could be subbed in and out as super mega powerful capital ships. Then they could, keep up the facade and Russia would always have this big mega strong flagship. That kind of thing. See, the Russian High Command realised that it was impossible for the Kuznetsov to fill the role of flagship for the new Russia, at least the physical flagship. On paper she can get called the flagship, but something about a giant black soot belching highly flammable piece of crap doesn't exactly give the idea and vibe of the power that the new 2000s Putin Russia wanted to show off. But a nuclear-powered battle cruiser that could wipe out a US carrier group, now that's some propaganda you can work with. The problem of keeping the Peter the Great or the Peter Veliki in service could be sort of solved in the short term by using the Ushakov or the ex-Kirov for parts. See, back in the 90s when the ship was new, it kind of had a bit of a Soviet nuclear reactor moment. And she'd been acting as a parts mill for the other three ships since anyway, so it kind of worked. But eventually, the Peter Veliki would run into the issue of overuse and inoperability. As the 2000s continued on, the Russians realised that the Veliki was on its way out and it needed replacing. Of course, the idea was to eventually replace the ships with a new large class of destroyer, but that is something we'll get to in a little bit. But in the short term, the Soviets went and looked at the Lazarev and inspected it, going, alright, we'll use this ship to replace the Veliki, looking to return the ship to service and refit it into a state where it could one-for-one replace it. But as it turns out, abandoning a ship in Siberian bays for over a decade and not bothering to maintain them does not constitute a happy return to service. The Russian High Command made the choice here to scrap the ship, and as of October 2022, the absolutely clapped out and broken Admiral Lazarev has been slowly broken apart. It looks like it is still being scrapped as we speak, although news is a bit hazy on that one. Turning to the other white elephant, the Nakamal was then chosen to be the new old toy. And that's where our tale sort of really begins, because this refit technically begins in 2015. And it's still ongoing as of the 1st of the 1st, 2025. Speaking of, haven't given you a new video all year, so sorry guys. I had to get my one dad joke in, sue me. Nakamal's refit officially began in 2015, but unofficially the ship has been in a state of needing and receiving intermittent repairs since 1997 to stay afloat and be able to return to service on supposedly short notice. In reality, the ship has been unable to leave port since it was decommissioned. According to TASS, yes, the Russian news media source, aka the propaganda sludge pipe that certain Twitter-loving blue checkmarks deep-throat as real free-thinker facts, the ship was supposed to be in refit for 5 years from 2015 to 2020, at which point she was supposed to be taken out to sea under her own power and rejoin the fleet to replace the Peter Veliki as the flagship of the Russian Navy, or to operate side by side. This quickly was pushed back to 2021, then 2022, then 2023, then November 2024. It is now the 1st of the 1st, 2025, and we still do not have a date. Are you sensing a pattern here? The thing can't leave port yet under its own power. The purpose of this refit, again according to Russian media, is to replace and upgrade the vessel's systems, but in particular its weaponry, to include the super mega powerful uber weapon Zircon, that is apparently a hypersonic missile that nothing can ever intercept. At least that's what Twitter tells me, and as Elon Muskovich says, Twitter is the real source for true journalism and facts. It is suspected that the Veliki can't actually sail for periods of time, other than simple showing the flag cruises due to a lack of infrastructure at its home port and a lack of upgrades during the last 2 decades. Very similar to how the Kuznetsov is suffering from the fact that every time it ties up to the jetty, it has to power the whole jetty. It can't just be, plugged in to the power grid, like, for example, an American aircraft carrier can, or any other ship from any other navy that knows how to maintain them. So with the Veliki on its last legs, the Kuznetsov in pieces and unable to move, and probably never moving again, the lack of a major surface combatant has left the northern fleets of the Russian Navy incredibly weak. So weak that if the US Navy decided to just not bother to go to Europe and the Royal Navy decided to go on a holiday to the Caribbean, the French Navy alone could probably body everything that Russia has that can actually sail in the region. The lack of a replacement for the Veliki certainly is a real problem, and it's spurring on desperation to get the Nakamal back into service, ignoring the fact that its weapons can and have regularly been intercepted by the weapons the West possessed decades ago, as has been highlighted in Ukraine. Some Russian news media sources have questioned the reason for the delay, but there really aren't any answers. It's just delay, delay, and delay. But that begs the question, why refit a ship that is nearly 4 decades old? There really isn't a definitive answer here, and we won't know for sure unless the Russian state develops any kind of transparency, which, not likely. But we can wager a guess based on what we know. And it has something to do with the fact that the Navy is struggling to replace anything from the Soviet Union, because the Russian military-industrial complex, well, if you think America's ruled by one, oh boy, it's time to talk about the Russian one, which is, it's certainly a vibe. You will all know that after the Soviet Union, as I said before, Russia inherited or stole most of the USSR's navy, centering their new fleet around the carrier Kuznetsov, the 4 Kirovs, and other large cruisers of the Kara and Slava class. There were destroyers such as the Udaloys and Sovremenis as the backbone as well, and of course the submarines. This was absolutely fine in the 90s and left Russia in a very powerful position at sea. The Slavas and the Kirovs were new, so were the Sovremenis and the Udaloys, relatively speaking, and so was the Kuznetsov. The Karas, though, well, they were very, very old, as were some of the other ships that they inherited, such as the Grishas. The destroyers were a little older, but this was 1991, over 30 years ago now. These ships, even though they were a few years old, were absolutely fine. They were strong. The Russian fleet, the Russian Bear, was threatening. But the cracks first started showing with the Kuznetsov, with the new Russia being unable to afford to keep the thing running or build anything to fix it when it broke. But it wasn't just the Kuznetsov, because as we saw earlier, the Kirovs were mostly retired as fast as possible, just keeping just one in service. The submarines suffered most of the same fate, laid up in port with crews just big enough to maintain them, so that they looked on paper as part of the fleet, something that would have disastrous consequences when the Kursk exploded just a few years later. The Russian High Command, to their credit, actually realised in the early 2000s that this way of doing things really would not work in the next 10 to 20 years, and that replacements would need to be made. Now, in the short term, the idea was, like I said, the Kirovs could be swapped out, but there would need to be a new flat top to replace the Kuznetsov. Russia couldn't just build one, but they designed one during the Soviet Union called the Orel, and they were getting to around building it, so that was a plan they could base the Storm on, which is a new-fangled, dangly designed Russian aircraft carrier. Slight issue with that, the only place they could build it is Mykolaiv in Ukraine, and Ukraine's not exactly going to build them an aircraft carrier, let alone now. But as a stopgap, they went to Europe and went shopping for assault carriers / helicopter carriers, something that was very fashionable at the time, mind you. This is the mid-2000s to late 2000s, early 2010s. See, France and Spain were in the middle of attempting to woo Australia to buy the Mistral class or the Juan Carlos class to replace the old Australian assault ships. Eventually, Australia went out and picked the Spanish design, becoming HMAS Canberra and HMAS Adelaide. Turkey has since picked this design as well and is building its own variant of the class. But the French, feeling a bit sore, were still, wanting to sell some ships. They built 3 Mistrals for themselves, but they managed to sell 2 to Russia. The idea was that these ships would be built in France and then sold on and given to Russia. They would be accepted into service. One would join the Black Sea Fleet, and the other was either going to the Pacific Fleet or the Northern Fleet, but Russia would have flat tops again. On the flip side, the Navy started an ambitious building program of small, heavily armed corvettes, something that could really buff up the numbers and still put up a fight, and complete the tasks, patrolling the waters, gunboat diplomacy, the kind of things that, your dictatorial state needs you to do. And after all, at the time, they're really only fighting Georgia. When I say fighting, they are bullying Georgia because Georgia dares to not want to be part of Russia and, doing horrific things in Chechnya. Joining these new small ships was a set of new frigates built with the help of Indian money, as the Indian Navy had paid exorbitantly for the refitted Baku, aka the Vikramaditya, a carrier. Indian money would further fund Russian naval resurgence, paying for the replacement of more old frigates and destroyers, with new ships built for both Russia but also for India. By 2012, everything was looking a bit up, at least for the surface fleet. In 2014, it was planned that the old Kara-class cruisers and some of the old corvettes and frigates would all be replaced by newer, more powerful ships. And on its way too was the new submarine Belgorod, which could carry that, psycho nuclear torpedo that could, throw cobalt everywhere and make places uninhabitable, according to Twitter. Yeah, that was a thing. And then we come to the old Kirovs, the Slavas and the destroyers, all now so long in the tooth that most couldn't sail, and if they could, their states were such that if an American equivalent was inspected and found in that position, their captains would be imprisoned. Take evidence from the Moskva. The Ukrainians should not have been able to destroy it with 2 missiles, yet they did. The grand plan was to replace these ships, the Udaloys, the Sovremanis, the Kirovs, and the Slavas, with one class of 12 large destroyers, basically cruisers. The Leader class, or Leader class, aka Project 23560. The Leaders would replace all of the cruisers and destroyers. They would be nuclear powered and be comparable in size to the Kirovs, shorter by about only 20 meters and a bit less in displacement. They would be armed with the Onyx, Caliber, and Zircon. The exact same armaments the Nakamal is currently being refitted with, but keep that in mind. These new ships would lead fleets, hunt in packs, and form the core of the new Russian Navy, with the assault carriers and the frigates being able to go straight at these new formations of Royal Navy carrier groups, the French carrier groups. And the idea was that, like the old times, they could use their powerful missiles as a pack to overwhelm NATO carrier battle groups. The design was an evolution of previous cruiser and destroyer designs that was finalised roughly in the mid-2010s, but they had been in the works for many years prior. On the surface, everything was coming up Russia. Everything looked good. New surface ships, new subs, new designs, and I'll be honest, these ships look pretty damn cool, not gonna lie. And it looks scary. The Royal Navy was a bit spooked from all their budget cuts under their, successive governments that they replaced their carriers with 2 large carriers, the Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales. The French looked at and they're commissioning a new super carrier in the coming years. Brand new destroyers, new frigates. All of these new ships are being laid down by Europe. Super cruisers, basically, by Germany that look terrifying on paper, are all being laid down because this is what they were expecting. They were expecting a very powerful modern Russian fleet. And then 2014 happened. And this is where the cracks became cavernous, even to those who weren't looking for them. When Russia invaded Ukraine, and yes, it invaded Ukraine in 2014, it wasn't rebels who somehow found heavy weapons and rose up. No. It was the Russian military and the Russian state that invaded Ukraine because, Ukraine dared to say no to being a slave to its bigger neighbour. When Russia did this, it was the biggest fumble in naval shipbuilding since the scale of Plan Z's failure in 1939. The French, having absolutely none of it when Russia crossed the border into Crimea, cancelled the contract for the 2 Mistrals, which were, mind you, effectively completed and waiting for delivery in port. They were instead sold to Egypt a couple of years later. Russia chucked a hissy fit, then they were told, right, leave Ukraine, you get the ships, and they went, no, we're not in Ukraine. And then France turned around and went, well, don't get the ships then, stop lying. And then Russia turned around and said, oh, well, we'll build our own then. Get to those. The imports for the new frigates' sensors and power plants dried up, slowing construction. Interestingly enough, parts of these new frigates' engines actually, for some of them, came from, of all places, Ukraine. The Belgorod was again delayed. Laid down in the 90s, designed as a sister to the Kursk, which itself was designed in the 70s. The boat would now not enter service until 2022. Any chance of the Kuznetsov's replacement actually being laid down disappeared, and that's before we even get to the Kirov's replacement. The leaders, all 12 planned, were now so far beyond reach that it wasn't funny. So instead, desperate to keep up appearances, the Navy looked to the Nakamal, being held together already by hopes and dreams, and sent her in for a refit that, interestingly, would outfit her exactly as if she was a leader. A shell pretending to be something she was not. A Redmin, if you will. But things haven't got any better for the Russian naval part of their MIC because, as the war in Ukraine has evolved into a full-scale invasion, and /G word that I can't say, the Navy came to realise that making these large ships was impossible. Two of them were supposed to be in the water by 2028, but now the Navy has to resort to small corvettes and occasionally what they called super frigate, called the Gorshkov class. The Gorshkovs are barely 2/3 of the size of the new Type 26 class frigates being built in Scotland for the Royal Navy, just to give you some context. This is before we even get to the fact that the supplies are going missing from these shipyards, fuel is being sold for machines, and important parts are just not making it into Russia with the sanctions. These ships are not being built. It's not happening. It's gotten so bad that the Russian Navy can't even get the Nakamal to sail under its own reactor, after a decade and $1 trillion rubles spent on it in refit. There is a certain poeticness to the fact that Admiral Nakamal, the real man, was the example of the shining light that was a powerful and highly professional Russian Navy for all of about 5 minutes until he died. It is poetic that his namesake should be the greatest example of what the modern Russian Navy and state has become. So what will we see in future from the Russian Navy? Will we see the new modern yet smaller potent fleet? No, we will not. Russia has lost the naval war in the Black Sea so badly it hides in port, barely daring to leave. Its flagship sits on the bottom, designated a Ukrainian cultural heritage site in the Black Sea, and even its new corvettes sit alongside it as artificial reefs. There will be no new carrier, the Mistral class assault carriers will never come, sold to Egypt instead. The Project 23900, a Soviet design rushed into construction to replace the Mistrals, will never be finished. After 10 years they sit in pieces on the slipways. For comparison's sake, the HMAS Canberra, Australia's flagship, was laid down in 2009 and commissioned in 2014. It doesn't take 10 years to build an assault carrier. The new frigates are mostly now being built to be exported to raise capital, with the most recent one being delivered to the Indian Navy. The new submarines, if you can call them new, are delayed, and now well and truly outnumbered by their American and French and British counterparts. Not to mention the fact that most of the new submarines being laid down are the old Kilo designs, which are Cold War vintage in themselves. And the Nakamal? Well, she joins a fleet on its knees. Its crew is being sent as ground forces into the Ukrainian front lines, and that's if she can get commissioned back into the fleet, with the odds looking less and less likely, not even considering what passes as a ship that is able to be commissioned into the Russian Navy in 2025. But hey, it's the Russian Navy. It can always get worse. And when it does, I'm right here, and you'll hear about it. Thank you all for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas to all of you, or happy whatever holidays, whichever one you celebrate. We're all a bit different, who knows. A little tidbit before we end. I greatly appreciate all the things sent to the PO box. Mostly, the giant purple floppy thing that's in the shape of a man's appendage. I didn't need that. Don't know who did it. Did not need it. Would still like to know who did it. And question you because you spent a lot of money on something that is, well, it doesn't do much. It just sort of flops around. But anyway. Now, honestly, I feel a bit like a princess being spoilt from all the models that have shown up, but please, please, please be a bit more creative than sending me horrific model kits from Trumpeter of Soviet warships. I get the meme, it's funny. I have the Moskva in 1/350 scale. I've built it, it's sitting on my desk above me. I'm going to turn it into a diorama with a lot of blue and yellow on it, and I'm going to have the famous line from Snake Island sprayed onto the diorama base in the colours of the Ukrainian flag. It's going to be something nice. I have a 1/350 scale Kuznetsov that I could probably put a baby in to sleep in. It's so big, I could use it as a crib. I don't need more Soviet ships, please. They don't need friends. They really don't need friends. There's only like 2 or 3 other in that scale that I can think of, and I really don't need them. I appreciate you all, but I don't need them. But anyway, Happy New Year. Here's to 100,000 subs in 2025.